Have you ever had that feeling that something enormous is about to happen, but you just don't know exactly when? Like that heavy silence before a storm, when the wind suddenly stops and the air gets too thick to breathe. That's exactly what One Piece has been building for decades with Shanks and Blackbeard. These two never faced each other, and that's no accident. Oda didn't forget. Oda never forgets. Think about it. Two guys who stood side by side on Roger's crew. Two men who chose completely opposite paths after that. One became the most mysterious yonko in the world. The other became the most dangerous villain the world has ever seen. And across more than 1,000 chapters since then, they simply never met face to face. That's masterclass narrative tension. That's Oda holding the reader's breath for years on end. But now, with the final arc in motion, the pieces are converging. Everything is moving. And the question the entire One Piece community has been asking out loud is Shanks versus Blackbeard finally going to happen? Let's break this down together, because the answer isn't simple, and the road to it is far more fascinating than you'd expect. First, we need to understand who Shanks really is, because the fandom still underestimates this man. Shanks isn't just the guy who gave Luffy the Straw Hat and lost his arm to a sea creature. That simplified version exists to protect the mystery around him, because when you start pulling at the threads of Shanks' story, what comes out the other side is something staggeringly deep. He was a child on Roger's ship. He was there when the king of the pirates died. He carries memories and knowledge that virtually no other living character holds. He knows what the One Piece is. He knows what the Void Century is. He showed up at Marineford and stopped the greatest war in world history with a single appearance, without even needing to draw his sword. And then there's that moment most people underestimated. Shanks went to the Gorosei. He walked up to the 5 most powerful men in the world government, the people who literally run the world, and had a private conversation with them about Blackbeard. That's not a detail. That's the script being revealed. Shanks knew. Shanks always knew that Blackbeard was a different kind of threat from anything that had ever existed, and he tried, in his quiet way, to do something about it. The problem is, Blackbeard didn't wait. Blackbeard, whose real name is Marshall D, is perhaps the scariest character in One Piece for one specific reason. He isn't powerful by accident. He's powerful by patience. This man waited 50 years. 50 years inside Whitebeard's crew acting like an ordinary sailor, waiting for the exact moment the Yami Yami fruit would become available. He killed a crewmate to get that fruit. Then he used the chaos after Marineford to invade the most dangerous prison in the world, recruit the most powerful criminals alive, and emerge as a yonko in record time. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever climbed to the top that fast with such a surgical strategy. And the cherry on top, he has 2 devil fruits, something that was considered impossible within the logic of this universe. He has the power of darkness, which absorbs and cancels any other power. And he has the power of earthquakes, which Whitebeard used to literally split the world in half. A man with both those powers, with that patience, with that level of strategic intelligence, is exactly the kind of threat Shanks recognized before anyone else did. And that's why the confrontation between them was never just a fight between yonkos. It was always a collision between 2 completely opposite philosophies about what the world should be. Now here's the part most fans don't stop to really think about. What is the actual connection between Shanks and Blackbeard? These 2 men never shared a crew. They never sailed together. And that's exactly what makes their connection so much more unsettling. It isn't built on brotherhood betrayed. It's built on something colder. Blackbeard spent decades inside Whitebeard's crew. Shanks grew up on Roger's ship. 2 completely different worlds, 2 completely different legacies. But somewhere along the way, their paths crossed and left a mark that never healed. The 3 scars on Shanks' face, those marks he's carried since anyone can remember, which Whitebeard himself confirmed were made by Blackbeard. The exact circumstances of that encounter have never been fully explained. We don't know when it happened or where, but we know it was real, and we know it was violent enough to leave permanent damage on one of the most powerful men in the world. Think about what that means. Blackbeard, before he was a yonko, before he had any devil fruit, before the world knew his name, was already dangerous enough to scar Shanks. That's not a backstory detail. That's Oda telling you exactly who Marshall D has always been. And those scars are the physical proof of a conflict that was never resolved, an open wound between two men that not even decades of distance could close. Shanks didn't forget, and Blackbeard, he certainly knows that. But here comes the twist that complicates everything, and what I think is the most interesting point in this whole conversation. Shanks died. In chapter 1079, in a confrontation that lasted basically a single panel, Shanks defeated Eustace Kid so completely it was almost uncomfortable to read. And shortly after, in chapter 1087, Shanks faced Admiral Ryokugu, and it was clear he wasn't playing around. He was moving with a very specific purpose. And then came the chapter nobody expected. Shanks traveled to Elbaf to meet with the giants, to build alliances, to prepare for something. And then the arc took a direction the entire community is still processing. Oda killed Shanks. In chapter 1118, confirmed in a way that leaves no room for interpretation, Shanks is dead. Defeated by Blackbeard in a confrontation that happened off-panel, almost surgically, as if Blackbeard had waited for exactly the right moment and simply executed the plan. And that changes everything, because now the question stops being, will Shanks face Blackbeard, and becomes something far darker and far richer narratively. Shanks' death isn't the end of their story, it's the beginning of the final act. Think about the narrative structure Oda built. Luffy wore Shanks' hat throughout his entire journey. That hat is the symbol of the promise, the inheritance, the legacy. Luffy swore he'd return that hat to Shanks once he became a great pirate, and now Shanks is dead before that could happen. That's a promise that can no longer be fulfilled the way it was made, and in One Piece, promises matter more than anything. Blackbeard killed the man who gave Luffy the hat. Blackbeard destroyed that promise before it could be completed. And if there's one thing Luffy's entire journey has taught us, it's that he doesn't forgive those who hurt the people he loves. The confrontation between Luffy and Blackbeard, already built as the definitive final clash, now carries a completely new emotional layer. It's not just hero versus villain anymore, it's the heir against the assassin of the legacy. But hold on, because Oda rarely does anything as straightforward as it seems. There's a theory circulating powerfully in the community, one I think deserves serious attention. What if Shanks isn't completely gone? I'm not talking about a magical resurrection or convenient plot armor. I'm talking about the Yami Yami fruit, Blackbeard's power. The Yami Yami can absorb people, drain powers, nullify haki, but what if within the specific logic of that fruit, there's some kind of connection to the people it defeated? What if Shanks' consciousness or part of his haki persists somehow linked to the hat? That might sound too speculative, and it probably is, but in One Piece, the haki of great warriors persists. Roger's memory persists. Ace's will persisted through Luffy. One Piece doesn't treat death as an absolute full stop for those who lived with enough intensity. And Shanks lived with more intensity than anyone in this world. Let's talk about what Shanks' death means for the balance of power in the world. Blackbeard eliminated a yonko. That hadn't truly happened since Marineford, and even then, the circumstances were completely different. Whitebeard died in open battle, surrounded by enemies, after absorbing an absurd amount of damage without backing down. Shanks was defeated in what appears to have been a far more private, far more calculated way. That puts Blackbeard in a position no character in this series has ever occupied. He is now, without any shadow of doubt, the #1 threat in the world, not just the pirates, to everyone. The world government, already collapsing after the events of Egghead, now faces an enemy who holds two impossible powers, who eliminated one of the most powerful men on the planet, and who is clearly moving towards something far greater than simply becoming king of the pirates. Blackbeard wants the One Piece, but more than that, Blackbeard wants the throne of the world. And with Shanks out of the way, who's gonna stop him? The answer the narrative points to is Luffy. It always was Luffy, since the very first chapter when that straw hat changed heads and an impossible promise was made. But now Luffy will face Blackbeard carrying the additional weight of knowing what happened to Shanks, with the understanding that the hat he's worn his entire life represents something that was violated in an irreparable way.
And here's what I find most fascinating about how this confrontation should unfold. Luffy isn't going to fight Blackbeard with anger, not the way he fought Doflamingo or Kaido. Luffy's anger runs hot and immediate, but what Blackbeard represents is something different, something that will demand from Luffy a kind of maturity we've been watching him build across the entire saga. Blackbeard is Luffy's spiritual opposite in every sense. Luffy sets people free. Blackbeard imprisons them. Luffy fights for those he loves without calculating the consequences. Blackbeard calculates every move for decades before acting. Luffy believes the dream is worth the price you pay for it. Blackbeard believes no dream is worth anything, that everything is just power waiting to be taken. These two aren't just rivals, they are the question and the answer about what it means to be free. There's a detail most people skip over when talking about this clash, and I think it's the key to understanding what Oda is actually building. The Gomu Gomu fruit that Luffy accidentally ate as a child wasn't a random fruit. It was stolen from the world government, and increasingly solid evidence within the manga suggests that fruit is actually the Nika fruit, the sun god fruit, one of the most powerful and rare that exists. Blackbeard spent decades inside Whitebeard's crew waiting specifically for the Yami Yami fruit. He knew what he wanted. He had a very specific target. And Luffy, without knowing it, spent his entire life carrying a power that was destined for him in a way we still don't fully understand. Two men, two fruits of absolute power, one found through accident and destiny, the other seized through patience and cold calculation. The universe of One Piece was built for these two to meet at the end.
So, going back to the original question, is Shanks versus Blackbeard going to happen? It already happened, and Blackbeard won. But that doesn't close a story. In fact, it transforms a story on a level I didn't expect to see happen this soon. Shanks' death isn't a narrative defeat, it's an elevation. It's Oda removing the last shield that stood between Luffy and the final confrontation. It's the universe saying, there's nobody left to protect you now. Now, it's you. Shanks did what he came to do. He planted the seed. He put the hat on the right head. He protected Luffy while Luffy wasn't ready. And when the time came, he faced the greatest predator in the world. He lost, yes, but the story he started doesn't end with him. There's a scene I keep coming back to when I think about how this ends. Luffy with Shanks' hat on his head, looking Blackbeard dead in the eyes. And in a universe where the hockey of will can pass from generation to generation, where the memory of great warriors lingers in the wind and the waves, maybe Shanks isn't as absent as he seems. Maybe when Luffy smiles in that moment, and he will smile because Luffy always smiles before a fight that matters, maybe that smile carries something of Shanks inside it. The air of the straw hat against the man who left those scars on the face of everyone he loved. That's One Piece. But before we wrap up, I need to leave something with you. Oda isn't writing a happy ending the way we're used to. He's writing a true ending. And true endings have a cost. Shanks was part of that cost, and he probably won't be the last. What's being built right now, with Blackbeard at his peak power, with Luffy carrying everything that's happened, with the world government in freefall and the secret of the Void Century on the verge of being revealed, is the conclusion of a story that began before Luffy was even born. A story about what freedom actually means, about the price of a dream, about whether the world deserves to be free. And at the center of it all, two men who represent completely different answers to that question are going to meet. One wearing the hat of a man who believed in him when nobody else did, the other carrying the scars that man left on the face of everyone he loved. The last thing I want to leave you thinking about is this. If the One Piece really is something that changes the world the moment it's found, if it truly represents proof that the world government lied to humanity for 800 years, and if Blackbeard gets there first with all the power he's accumulated, will he use it to set the world free the way Luffy would? Or will he use it to imprison the world in a way that's never had a name before?